I'm Jeff Sickinga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea.
Thank you for joining us today for The American Idea. I am Cara Rogers-Stevens, Associate Professor of History at Ashland University. Our topic today is a timely one: threats to free speech and freedom of the press. These issues are currently being hotly debated, not only here in America, but also across the pond. In England, in particular, speech has become increasingly regulated. Numerous individuals have been jailed in recent months for controversial social media posts or reposts, or for actions such as praying silently or holding up signs, peaceful, outside abortion clinics. And there is an ongoing debate in England among that kind of regulation of speech, and also among British politicians about the possibility of a government cover-up of crimes that occurred in order to cover up the race of the criminals, which was a controversial topic there. This is a cover-up that Elon Musk famously tweeted about back in January. You might remember the firestorm over that. Just within the last couple of weeks, Americans have begun our own fresh debate over the limits of free speech, with the Trump administration's decision to deport a former Columbia student who is in the country on a green card. There are arguably few issues that are as important as freedom of speech and of the press. It's always worthwhile, I think, to discuss what constitutes speech, what is the government's role in regulating speech, what should it be, and how does limiting speech affect the future of Republican self-government? And of course, some historical context is very important in order to have that discussion. Here to provide some historical context for us today on the American Idea podcast is Miles Smith. He's an assistant professor of history at Hillsdale. He earned his PhD from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, and he researches and writes about political, intellectual, and religious history in America and Europe. His latest book is called Religion and Republic, Christian America, from the Founding to the Civil War. It's a very interesting discussion of the concept of Christian nationalism and what that has meant over the years. And Dr. Smith also writes for popular publications such as the Gospel Coalition, Public Discourse, The Federalist, and Law and Liberty. Welcome to the show, Miles.
Yeah, it's good to see you again, Cara.
Good to see you too. So you recently published an essay with Law and Liberty about the history of freedom of speech and press here in the United States. So I'm going to start our conversation today by quoting you back to yourself. Here's the final sentence of that essay. You said, "The point of a free press is a free press, even if it is a complete mess." What did you mean by that? What is so important about a free press, and why is it acceptable even if it is a complete mess?
Well, I think this is important for people on sort of both sides of the aisle to think about. Well, I think we have this idea that the point of a free press is to tell people the truth. Historically, the truth is litigated in places like universities and in churches. The free press is sort of meant to be a battle of ideas, a battle of not just ideas, but a battle of information. The press is, in the United States, by its nature, partisan. It means that you're supposed to have sort of warring newspapers presenting different sort of stories and telling, and you're presenting it to hopefully an educated populace, ideally a liberally educated populace, capable of self-government and capable of sort of discerning the truth in this kind of in this sort of variety of places. So the people who are actually supposed to decide the truth or get to the truth, maybe a better way of saying it, are the people, not the press or the government. And so what we sort of tend to think is, well, it's the government and the press that need to tell us what the truth is, and then the people follow along. And so this is actually very different than what, at least in the founding era, the Republican small r idea of a free press was. The free press is sort of meant to be a battleground. of ideas, of statements, of narratives. And that's useful for a free self-governing citizenry. Um, it's not necessarily a place where the government sort of litigates its own talking points. And so even the government is in this sense a player in a free press regime. The government is not the referee. The government doesn't get to say this person's right and this person doesn't. The government is a player on the court, but perhaps the difference between the government and all the other players is the government happens to carry the sword or a gun, whichever way you want to think about that. So this a free press in a free press regime like the one that's established in the American Constitution, I think is somewhat different than even most Americans think of. It's not meant to tell you the truth. It's meant to sort of provide a battleground where the people, hopefully rightly educated and self-governing, can discern the truth.
That is so interesting. That is very different from maybe the popular imagination would go back to the brave members of the press who exposed the Watergate scandal, or Walter Cronkite being a voice of reassuring reason. And we look back to this golden age where the media could be unbiased and all Americans could unify around watching the evening news. And a lot of my students tend to think of modern media as a problem, that when it gets so partisan, we complain about how MSNBC has one point of view and Fox has another point of view. Why can't they just all tell the truth? But what you're saying is actually what we're seeing with how partisan our press is now is normal and perhaps even a good thing.
Yeah, we should be actually very comfortable, I think, with openly partisan press. I don't want MSNBC to pretend to be neutral, the same way I wouldn't want maybe Fox News to pretend to be neutral. We need all these voices. I think the free press needs all of these. Our search for unity is really perhaps a search for a censorious regime in a lot of ways. We really don't want a lot of voices at times. So much of this is downstream from World War II, Franklin Roosevelt and the press controls that are established there. In fact, the idea of a neutral press, as it were, is usually wedded to the idea of national security. Because, and this is why what the examples you mentioned, Kara, are interesting because most of them took place in the Cold War.
Right.
And so we need to be a unified sort of, a unified nation, and you need one voice on these big questions because there's a bad guy out there. And in the cases you mentioned, the Soviet Union. That's not really how the founders understood it. They did not see the free press as needing to sort of get the right information to the people because of an external threat. You think about the era that you and I both studied, the early republic, of course. Jeffersonian newspapers and Federalist newspapers had widely divergent polemics about what was going on in the world.
And the editors were paid by the different political parties, and that was considered completely fine.
Yeah, that's right. So a partisan press would actually be perhaps a useful return in so many ways if we were just more comfortable with our press being partisan. But we've sort of gotten used to the idea of a quote unquote neutral press, almost a press that isn't a press anymore, the press that does the job of a church. Church declares truth to you, and we sort of think about the press that way.
Yeah.
Historically, of course, you only trusted journalists so far. There's a lot of 19th century polemics about journalists being the shadiest people in society, certainly not heroes. And so I think that our especially post-Cold War, post-World War II way of looking at the press is a departure even from what the Constitution would have wanted us to support and perpetuate.
So it sounds like there's a veneer of objectivity that modern reporters hold up as the standard for themselves. But perhaps it would be better if they just totally took down that veneer and admitted that they were not attempting to be objective. But what about the truth? Should there be a commitment to truth telling by members of the media? Is that something that the founding generation would have valued?
Yeah, I think that they do. I think the difference is what the sort of the syllogism of searching for truth, where they think the press plays into that is somewhat different than where we tend to think the press plays into it. The press is meant to provide an argument Of course, that's the nature. Newspapers are creations of political print politicization, right? They're 18th century creation. The newspapers that we know
Mhm.
are creations of political parties, right? The sort of the grand debates between the Whigs and the Tories in 18th century England. This is where you have sort of the advent of newspapers as we know of them. And so they're meant to sort of provide arguments between two political parties. And so if you were a Tory, you got the Tory paper. If you were a Whig, you got the Whig paper. And it was only sort of downstream from those political arguments that you have the wedding of what you might think of as information that was typically done in community centers.
Mm.
So what they did was they said, well, everybody reads the political argument, so why don't we like sell our cow on that same piece of paper or something like that? And so newspapers actually are creations of politics. They're creations of political debate,
Yeah.
um, and not creations of sort of truth declarations
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
sort of announcements. Of course, governments did have their own papers, but people understood, well, that's coming from the government, and the government has its own agenda. It's interesting that if you want to define historically places where there was a neutral press, you went to monarchies where there was no press freedom, because that was the press actually being sort of the statement of societal truth. Uh, and obviously, the United States is predicated on a rejection of that. So there's something actually uniquely theocratic about the idea that the press is supposed to be the place that we declare truth, because that would mean the press is not meant to be a place where there's debate.
Yeah, and that maybe leads me into my second question for you, something that you discuss in your essay in this Law and Liberty article, is that the British government has become increasingly concerned with misinformation or disinformation. And indeed, those are terms that our audience here today is also going to be familiar with. It's concerned that Americans and English people look to social media and they look to journalistic outlets in order to get crucial information in order for their nations to continue functioning. Well, you criticized the creation in England of the Counter Disinformation Unit, or the National Security and Online Information Team. What's the problem with those? Why do you regard those branches of the British government as problematic?
Well, I think that if you see what the nature of what they're doing, they're meant to shut down debate
Hmm.
functionally. And so it basically means that the only arbiter of truth will become the state. Um, and the final, not just the final, but really the main arbiter of truth becomes the state apparatus itself. I would say I would not want a Republican sort of created board of disinformation. I wouldn't want a Democrat board of disinformation, because I don't want a state deciding those things. I think that for a free republic of free peoples, the state is not the arbiter of what is true, right? A republic of the people, by the people, and for the people does not rely on the state to
Mhm.
tell it what is true. And so that's, I think, functionally what these boards of information are doing have really nothing to do with the press. They would like us to think that they're getting the bad stuff out of the media. But in the case of a state, that would mean the state is sort of saying nothing it's not accountable to anybody. It's essentially sort of trying to play God in a
So what's the
specific.
difference between something like that and a function that we do want the government to play? So, for example, um, somebody posting maliciously false information about a competitor, that could be successfully challenged in the courts, and American people would trust the court system to deal with that kind of misinformation, if you will, or pornography, child pornography, something that
Right.
is illegal in the United States. We would trust the state to be, in your word, the arbiter there of whether or not that can be presented to the public. So what's the difference between a state having a disinformation board, if that state is accountable
Yeah.
to the people? Is that not just a way of the people governing themselves and protecting themselves from widespread misinformation?
It's a good question. Of course, the main thing that we're talking about, and historically, what would have been understood is speech. So pornography is speech. That's a sort of a modern information that I think you're going to see that is being challenged right now, and will probably eventually, if the courts in the United States go the way they seem to be doing, it's probably unlikely that they will continue to consider pornography, for example, speech. So that may be a dodge on that. But I think what's going on, for example, is the distinguishing between libel and slander has some role in this. But also, I mean, are you able to print a rumor about someone? And
Right.
again, we think about you are a scholar of Thomas Jefferson. Was James Callender was he should he have been disciplined
Huh.
by the state for printing something that's widely debated? We still aren't sure, right, about the nature of Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, but of course it appears in papers at the behest of someone like James Callender. So is that true? Is that false? Obviously, if you are someone who has a lot of problems, say with the slave regime, is this incitement to violence? That Jefferson is keeping a young woman, a young enslaved woman, as a de facto concubine. This was a question, by the way. If details about someone's life were litigated in the public in the early republic, it was seen as, well, is this inciting abolitionists to go after them? Of course, the government of South Carolina cites this as a reason they secede. That our details of our lives are being bandied out in the press, and that somebody's going to hurt us.
So
And
South
so,
Carolina was saying abolitionist arguments being made
yep.
public was a reason why South Carolina needed to secede.
Yeah.
Yes, gotcha. Yeah.
And so, it's a good question. I think that it's really, do you want the tide to go to the people or the tide to go to the state? Where in the baseball, we have this expression, the tie goes to the runner. If you can't tell the guy who's running the base is safe. If we can't tell, who do we want to sort of give the nod to on these questions? Do we want to give the nod to the state or maybe to the people? And this is where I think my use of the term mess comes from. That can be a bit of a mess, right? But would I rather have a messy regime of the free press, or maybe a tidy one that the state oversees? I think I'd still prefer the mess.
Interesting.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to learn a little more about the Ashbrook Center and how you can help us continue our work with teachers, students, and citizens.
I'm Chad Kiefer, Director of Philanthropy and Strategic Partnerships here at Ashbrook. At its heart, America's story is about the lives of patriots who have given their last full measure of devotion to preserve and protect what it means to be an American. But the tragic truth is that the American story is being rewritten as one of oppression and despair. Back in 1776, the founders took a chance when they created a new government built on principles of liberty. They took a chance on America. Now I'm challenging you to do the same. Your gift to Ashbrook today reaches students, teachers, and citizens across the country, helping them to understand why America is worthy of their devotion. With so many forces eroding our history and taking away from our principles, isn't it time we give America a chance? Your investment is encouraged now more than ever. Please visit us today at ashbrook.org/support.
So tell us a little bit more about the history of freedom of the press in the United States. How far back do protections for freedom of the press go in our republic, and where do they come from originally?
Well, it's actually quite contested. I think that Americans tend to think we have this sparkling, continuing tradition of the freedom of the press, but it's actually always been somewhat contested. I mean, the Alien and Sedition Act, which is back in the news now because of the Trump administration, essentially criminalized criticism of the Federalist government. John Adams and a congressman was thrown in jail from Vermont. Matthew Lyon was thrown in jail for a print criticism. So that sort of challenges our idea of this kind of sparkling, continuous tradition. I mean, a lot of the press freedom, what we think of the expansive press freedom, is a creation of the Jacksonian era, creation of the era after the War of 1812. And so you have, I think, the sort of newspaper wars, the newspaper battles, again, partisan typically between the Whigs and the Democrats. But that's where the proliferation of newspapers comes from, that era. The Gilded Age there's perhaps less prolific as far as newspapers go, but still very, very partisan, and quite expansive. Wartime tends to be a time when Americans sort of forget about the free press.
Hmm.
In most of the major American wars, government curtails press freedoms aggressively.
Hmm.
So, and so I think it's not as clean as we want to think. It's very much a contested tradition in the United States, and one that people will continue to contest. I don't think you're ever going to see some sort of eschatological vision of a perfectly free press in the United States. And so if you believe in the free press, like I do, you have to sort of fight for it. You have to push for it too.
You have a great George Washington quote in your essay. This is from 1795, so Washington was serving as our nation's first president. And he told Gouverneur Morris, in a government as free as the United States, where, quote, the people are at liberty and will express their sentiments, oftentimes imprudently,
Hmm.
and for want or lack of information, sometimes unjustly, allowances must be made for occasional effervescences. So, and you note that Washington didn't use this occasion, where I take it he was probably coming under some personal attack in the press, to complain about press freedom. He conceded that a free press sometimes made a mess. And Thomas Jefferson, I think, had a similar perspective on freedom of the press. As you mentioned, he came underneath what we would call tabloid attacks from men like James Callender and others. And the press could be quite vicious in the early republic, where during the election of 1800, Jefferson was said to be a complete danger to religion. He was going to destroy Christianity. He was going to burn Bibles. He was going to kill babies in the streets. There were personal and false claims made about political candidates. And two out of our first three presidents were very careful to argue the press should be allowed to be messy. That is what was new and unique in the history of the world, that here in this republic, truth was put on a pedestal. And as you say, the state was not going to be the arbiter of that, but rather Washington and Jefferson would have perhaps argued that truth could stand up for itself if debate was left free. Now, Adams, the second president, I think is maybe an exception to that rule, as you pointed out with the Alien and Sedition Acts, where he signed into law this bill that allowed his political enemies to be thrown in jail for their acts of free speech or their criticism of him. Do you think that's because Adams was president during a time of semi-war with France? Is that why we see this blip in the first three presidencies? Or was it something about his personality that made him a little bit more sensitive, perhaps, than Washington and Jefferson?
That's a great question. I think the quasi-war is going on. Quasi-war is an undeclared naval war with France during the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. But I think that I don't want to let Adams off that easily, because Washington doesn't have an easy sort of foreign policy life either. Of course, in 1795, he's under attack for signing the Jay Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
And he's accused of essentially treason. People say Washington sold out the country, and they say this aggressively so.
Yeah.
In 1796, Citizen Genet runs around sort of sponsoring what are pretty much seditious attacks in print over Washington. And yet Washington stays his hand, very similar to Jefferson does. I mean, Jefferson doesn't go after Jefferson, who has a bit of a temper. I think Jefferson sort of presented this placid man. I think he gets angry, but even Jefferson, as sort of furious as he is about some of the attacks on him, doesn't go after the press freedoms the way that Adams does. I think it's particularly unique. The passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts is a unique attack on the press.
Mm-hmm.
And it kills the Federalist Party. and kills their policies for the better part of 40 years.
So this law was in fact quite unpopular
Yeah,
after Adams's presidency. So it's kind of been
absolutely.
relegated to the dustbin of American history. At least we can say that.
Yeah, and rightly so. I think that the American people uh, really did believe in their Constitution, and
Yeah.
they really believed that a free press meant a free press. It did not mean that the President of the United States gets to decide which part of the free press can say what it's going to and which part can't. Um, and so, in that sense, I don't know if Jefferson initially would have ever entertained the idea of passing something like the Alien and Sedition Acts, but he has the good sense to not do anything like that. And so, yeah, not just not just Washington and Jefferson, but I think most presidents learned this lesson throughout the early republic. The presidents are relatively hands off regarding the press. I mean, sometimes to their fury, Andrew Jackson sort of experiences a significant number of press attacks in the 1828 election, and gets very angry about them. Sort of says, "I want to duel." Somebody, but he never so goes and says somebody should burn down the press.
Yeah.
It's always I would like to go. I'll have a duel with someone, and never we need to shut down this printing press or this newspaper. So I think that's telling in its own way.
That is fascinating. You're so right that a lot of these presidents could get angry. They're human beings, and reading their letters, you really get the sense that sometimes they were deeply personally offended. They were hurt. Washington actually stopped talking to Jefferson because he was hurt that something that Jefferson meant to stay private was published, and it sounded like a criticism of Washington. Or Jefferson, he started his political career a supreme supporter of freedom of speech, freedom of the press. By the end of his life, he was telling his correspondents that he didn't read any newspapers anymore. He didn't trust them. He didn't believe them. He thought it was a waste of his time. So it's interesting how these guys, they weren't perfect, and yet they prioritized this concept of the truth needs to be left out there to be publicly debated. It is not the role of the president to try to be an arbiter of truth or a punisher of liars in the press. But what about actions? So we've touched on this a little bit, but maybe can you just help us understand a little bit better? In the early republic, were there distinctions drawn between speech and actions? So in other words, are there times where freedom of expression is protected as a form of speech? Or are there certain actions like riots that are not considered protected by the government in the early republic era?
So a good way to answer this is to actually talk about maybe where the First Amendment finds its enforcement in the early republic. Two wonderful scholars, Carl Esbick and Jonathan Den Hartog, have written on the religious side of the First Amendment, and they note that the First Amendment, that includes both the religious and the press provisions, was not sort of understood to apply to states in the same way it applied federally. And so when it came to actions, states typically actually were somewhat aggressive in prosecuting what you might call freedom of expression. For example, the state of New York prosecutes a man who speaks disrespectfully of the Virgin Mary. A Protestant state does that, I should note.
Wow.
Aggressively prosecutes a man in 1811. Abner Kneeland in Massachusetts in the 1830s is also prosecuted for speech that's understood to be both disrespectful and sort of libelous of religious people. And so you have states doing this somewhat more aggressively than the federal government. And so I think in our own lifetime, in the late 1990s, the mayor of New York City tried to find a way of moving against an art installation that was widely seen to be disrespectful of the Virgin Mary. This is in the late 90s New York City. And so states and locales were perhaps where freedom of expression was policed more aggressively than at the federal level. Decency laws, for example, most states still had aggressive decency laws. You had, for example, blasphemy laws. So those things sort of determine speech at local and state levels where there wasn't an analogous federal prohibition against those things. So the sort of lowering the First Amendment as the First Amendment onto the states was a 20th century. I think the 1920s really is where you see that writ large.
Interesting. So there are more and more expressive acts that come underneath the protection of the First Amendment in the 20th century, as that 14th Amendment applies the Bill of Rights to the states.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Okay. And there's still, of course, going to be examples of things like public nudity that can be prosecuted. You can't argue that that's just your right of freedom of speech.
Yeah, all the states still have what we might call decency laws. And those are not negotiated along sort of as mirrored against the First Amendment. And so, which is interesting. And, First Amendment challenges to decency laws are almost always thrown out.
Yeah.
It's very hard to challenge decency laws with the First Amendment.
What about riots? Are riots forms of protected speech?
Historically, no, not at all. The United States is pretty aggressive about riots. In fact, the idea that a riot is speech is anachronistic. For example, think about the Civil War. You have the draft riots. No one in New York City thinks that the draft riots are protected speech.
Yeah.
Certainly not the U.S. government, which uses the military to put it down.
Right.
So riots are historically not understood to be protected speech at all.
And is that because of the potential threat to the lives and property of other individuals?
Riots are seen as innately disordered.
Right.
So the idea that there is such thing as an ordered riot that is sort of just doing speech would really surprise 19th century Americans. And because, has anyone seen a riot where something doesn't get broken? Pretty hard to find those, right? And so Americans obviously have a pretty like a near sacramental desire to protect property. And property protections are such that states, the feds, everybody is going to say, no, a riot's not protected speech at all. It's an incitement to violence.
Okay. So you've given us a pretty clear explanation for why there are actions, even related to speech, that should perhaps be punished, that should not be allowed. Are there times, do you believe, that freedom of speech itself clearly should be curtailed? Is there any appropriate regulation of free speech, in your opinion, or freedom of the press?
I think the answer is probably yes. And this is where it gets tricky, because most people would say, well, in wartime, there's some need. I just can't go out and print where the soldiers, like if they, you can't go print the battle plans if you were to get them of a battle. And so I think there is sort of a natural understanding that war means that the rules change.
Right.
Now, where and when and how those rules change, that's the debate, and that's where I think that's what you're seeing now, right? Like with questions of are people who are in sort of speaking certain way about world conflicts, are they actively aiding and abetting, say, Hamas, or aiding and abetting the Israeli government? And so war tends to change the rules. And so I think there's obviously some prudential reasoning, maybe you would call it natural reasoning, that overrides the constitutional prescriptions about free speech. But that's where lawyers get involved and sort of really get the answers about those things. Not being a constitutional lawyer, I don't have the good answer, but I think obviously war is a place that you see that there's broad acceptance that you can't have limitless free speech. That obviously, polities and nations and states have the right to protect themselves, and if self-protection, if certain curtailments of free speech is the price of self-protection, then seems to be acceptance of that. So,
and then it seems the real test of the longevity of our republic is, can governments relax their regulation after wartime is over? And can they restrain themselves from declaring a time of war when there's actually not a
Right.
legitimate conflict going on. And those are some really interesting moments in American history to discuss. Well, thank you so much for illuminating this very complicated issue and bringing this historical perspective to us. What is your next project going to be about?
So I'm doing, actually mentioning war, I'm doing sort of religion and the military in the early republic right now, sort of taking up, I did sort of more political institutions with the first book. And so this is sort of a follow-up. It's all the stuff I didn't really feel like I could talk about because war in the military is such a sort of a big topic unto itself. So I'm sort of asking about the nature of the American military. Does the American military share broad society's commitments to things like, press freedoms and whatnot? There's the famous statement about the American Navy. It's here to protect democracy, not to practice it. And so sort of thinking about those questions in relationship to religion.
Very interesting. Where can our readers follow you online?
I am on X at Ivy Miles, and I try to write semi-regularly. So I haven't done that quite as much recently because I've gotten married and I have a house and I have to do all that normal human stuff. But
All that
anyway,
adulting.
yeah, all that adulting. So.
Well, very good. Well, thank you again for joining us today on the American Idea podcast. And everybody else, I look forward to speaking to you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.